Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is the Skeptics Bible Project. Happy to be here with you again today. So, last time we began our discussion about the Joe Rogan Adam Curry interview, and we're going to continue on with that today. Hope you guys enjoy it.
Again, I'm new to this, but there's so many amazing things about the books in the Bible. There's code, certain scripture has exactly this amount of letters, but no consonants or vowels are duplicated. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that just seems like it's impossible to phony that up.
Okay. His conspiracy colors come out here. He starts talking about like Bible codes and counting the number of consonants and stuff. And there actually is some real numerology that Bible scholars and Hebrew scholars especially have noted. But it's all kind of literary formulations that are well known. In a poetic sense, in the same way that a poem, they may be written in a certain pattern where you have 5 syllables, then 2 syllables, then 5 syllables, and that pattern is consistent whatever the genre is. And we do see things like that in the Bible. There are certain numbers that seem important numbers that come up a lot. But to extrapolate that into this crazy numerological conspiracy theory that many people do, and they try to like find a secret code in the Bible. That's to me what he's hinting at here, and I think that's just batshit crazy.
Yeah, it's like if you take the conspiracy theorist route to get to Christianity, then you're going to take all this other baggage along with you. I don't know enough about the Bible code to give a real proper critique of it, except to say the same thing that John said. I mean, there's form criticism that literally looks at the way that the texts imitate other texts in the Hebrew Bible. I think we even looked at it a little bit when we talked about the birth narratives. Like when there's an appearance of an angelic being, there's certain things that people do in every instance or in many different instances in the scripture. And that's because they're following that certain form a lot of times. So, they fall on the ground. They, make some sort of, the angel makes a proclamation. They say that proclamation's impossible. The angel says, no, it's possible. So there's certain forms that seem to match up. Like John said, there's certain numerology in Hebrew that is that just the editors and the authors were probably like playing games with numbers as they were writing. It doesn't prove anything divine about the text. And I think that anyone that tells you that is not, it doesn't know what they're talking about.
And what people try to do with these secret Bible codes is to oftentimes predict the future or find some kind of secret teaching that no one ever knew about. And this is kind of Gnostic in a way. I mean, the Gnostics believed that there were secret teachings that God was only enlightening certain people. And, so we've talked about Harold Camping on the show before, who basically like looked at numerology in the Bible and determined like to the month of when Jesus would be returning. And of course he was wrong, and then he had to repredict it. So people do all kinds of crazy things. And I'll just say, you can do this with any piece of literature. I mean, you can try to find patterns and numerological things in any work of literature and then come to your own crazy conclusion. But again, historians and scholars don't take any of this stuff seriously. But it seems like Adam Curry is a self-identified conspiracy theorist, seems to be really attracted to that way of looking at the Bible.
Why? But a person being the actual Son of God, I would need a lot of evidence to believe that.
Evidence Demands a Verdict would be a great book to read. But just as I know that JFK was assassinated, and I really believe the CIA was involved because it's been written. I've just read documents and documents. So,
well, it seems that Adam Curry really wants more to talk about conspiracy theories because he keeps coming back to them, and here he's talking about the CIA and JFK. But and then when Joe Rogan rightfully is saying, hey, like, okay, but like, what's the actual evidence that Jesus is the Son of God? And he's right. You would need a lot of evidence to support that, not just a little bit of evidence. An extraordinary claim demands extraordinary evidence. And that's basically what Joe Rogan is saying. And his answer was just like, well, I'd read this book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And, like Ben and I definitely are going to address that book in detail at some point on this show. We'll probably do a series on it because so many people are so influenced by it. But that's not an answer. And like, okay, well, what evidence from that book really persuaded you? Because that was like the point that at this point in the interview, this is the point that I'm like, okay, good. Like, I want to hear his answer here. That like, and I just felt like he said, read this book, and then he started talking about JFK.
Yeah, I mean, thus far we've gotten in as much as you can believe that the CIA killed JFK, that Building 7 fell because of some nefarious purpose, and that we're all living in a simulation created by some alien race. As long as you can believe those things, then you should also believe in Christianity because there's even more evidence. Or he's as sure of Christianity as those things. Yeah, the claim is an extraordinary claim. I mean, the first thing to break down is probably the fact that we don't even necessarily have Jesus claiming to be the Son of God in every gospel we have. That's more of a later, or at least God eternal, God's Son equal to God eternal from all eternity.
And there's some question about, well, we're all the children of God.
Yeah.
So
I mean, he could be referred to as God's Son, but it doesn't have the same theologically loaded meaning that we have today, where we understand the meaning from John, the Gospel of John, where it means he's equal to God, part of the Trinity, part of the Godhead,
only begotten Son, etc.
Has been God from beginning. In Mark, it's much more ambiguous. We talked about it on another episode during the baptism. It seems like God is adopting Jesus, or it could be interpreted as he's begetting him at his baptism, and so that led to an adoptionist heresy. The idea that Jesus was the Son of God, in the sense that Adam Curry is talking about it's not clearly stated in even all of the Gospels.
But I think, Ben, that this is kind of like echoes the frustration, I think, of a lot of skeptics who are saying, okay, you're telling me this is super important for my life to believe this. And then I'm asking you, okay, what's the evidence that it's true? And I think this mimics the type of answers I used to get in church. Well, read this book. Here's a book, go read it. And and then I read the book and it's not really clear, or the answers aren't that good. And it's like, the answers are never good. And I think Christians should do a better job. I mean, you do have historically people like R.C. Sproul, people like, going back, C.S. Lewis, who I really did make an effort to answer these very difficult questions. Whether they did successfully or not, that's an open question. But at least they were really trying. And I think the frustration for a lot of skeptics is how many Christians just don't even attempt to give an answer at all. And it just feeds into everything that a lot of people believe about them, that it's an anti-intellectual endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the pitfalls of discourse in our time too, where nobody really wants to actually engage. So it's just like posting articles back and forth, where people are just talking past each other. It's like, oh, well, you don't believe me? Read this article. Well, the whole idea is to be able to actually understand the issue and be able to articulate the issue in a way that makes someone else understand. That's
and reading a book and reading an article is fine. I'm not putting that down.
No, but I mean, like, you should be able to have the discussion. If you've read the book and it's so convincing, then you should be able to have that discussion with the person without just telling them, go do a research project on your own. I mean, what convinced you in that book that makes you recommend it to me? I mean, this should be the conversation that you're able to have. Yeah. And I think that you're right. It's extremely, like, everybody recommends that book, but what's the evidence in that book? Well, I'll tell you the evidence that's in the Bible. The evidence in the Bible is a guy who had an experience where he fell off his horse on the road and claims that he saw a resurrected being that he used to persecute. And 3 women who went to the tomb saw a being, a man in the tomb, and left and didn't tell anyone. So you have a tradition that ends with 3 women not telling anyone. We don't even know how that tradition spread past that, if that's true.
Well, even that is all hearsay. I mean,
that's what the Bible presents as the actual. Yes. I mean, Paul says, oh, well, Jesus appeared to all these other witnesses that he lists, like some of them, and, up to 100 and whatever it is. But all of these claims are not really historically verifiable. So the evidence that the evidence is the evidence that Jesus was a person, is certainly sufficient that we should recognize that he existed as a historical figure, unless someone can make a really convincing argument otherwise. But the evidence for his resurrection, for example, is not really historically existent.
Yeah, and when we get into that book, or Josh McDowell's book, or Lee Strobel's book, we're going to talk all about that stuff, because, there's a big difference between arguing that there was a historical figure named Jesus that these books are based on, and saying all of these miraculous claims are true and that he was God incarnate on earth. I mean, that's a much bigger question, and it demands a lot more evidence. But I don't think we should delve too deep into that, because we are going to talk about it, and they on this interview don't delve into it.
Yeah, and it's just an assumption too that the evidence. I mean, John alluded to this before, if he didn't say it explicitly, but it's like an assumption that the evidence presented in the Gospels is a historical account, and just an understanding of the Gospels, like we talked about before. We know that Mark and Luke, to a certain extent, are exaggerations of Mark. And we know that Mark is the earliest gospel, and the other ones are not much later, but later. And we know that John comes from a totally different tradition that contradicts the synoptic gospels in many, many different ways. So to say both those traditions are true creates a lot of other problems. So even the historical account, quote unquote historical accounts that Josh McDowell would say are good, we know are filled with problems.
Yeah, and Adam Curry is as a conspiracy theorist who says he reads everything, and he reads and reads and reads. Well, he's obviously not reading like the scholarship like on New Testament studies, because he doesn't seem very familiar at all. Like, if what he's going to as evidence is Josh McDowell and evidence that demands a verdict, I mean, he could go to Raymond Brown. There's a lot of tons of material out there that he should be going to if he's going to go on like I said, the largest podcast in the world and talk about Christianity, and he comes armed with absolutely nothing.
Yeah, we talked about the relationship between conspiratorial thinking and Christianity before, and I think that again, this just shows, like, the conspiratorial thinking doesn't have to tie all the boxes. It doesn't have to tie all the evidence together, because the larger conspiracy is what ties it all together. And I think it's the same thing. Like, he doesn't need a lot of evidence. He needs a few things that are confirming what he's looking for, and then he can tie the rest of the conspiracy together.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to frame it. All right, let's move on to the next one.
When you look into the Bible and everything that's been written about the Bible, that's 100 million times more has been written about that, and it's survived all these years. So I'm just someone who reads.
Writes about The Shining, and a bunch of people review the writing of The Shining and write about The Shining. It doesn't mean that The Shining actually happened. You know, just because so many people are writing about this particular religion doesn't mean that there was a person.
But they haven't written about.
Doesn't mean they weren't. I'm not saying they were. I'm not saying I know. But I'm saying it doesn't mean that man was the Son of God.
I'm just telling you, my process is when I investigate things, and to me it was a conspiracy theory. Like, I'm just going to start reading, and I read for 3 weeks until I gave up and said, I can keep reading, but all the evidence just is thrown at me over and over and over again. If I'm going to believe certain things about JFK or 9/11 or whatever, which I've read as much as I can, but there's not that much. It's just to my own conscience. I have to, if I'm going to believe that after reading 50 years of documentation versus thousands of years of documentation.
But it's thousands of years of documentation of a story. See, the problem is anybody...
Multiple stories.
Like, multiple people have said today that they are the Son of God.
I just want to give Joe Rogan credit. I mean, I bash Joe Rogan a lot, but here he's basically saying exactly what I was going to say. Like, the fact that there's been a lot of stuff written about Christianity, and even the fact that like so many people throughout history have believed it, is not evidence of the truth of it at all. And it shouldn't be put forward as evidence. And I hear it put forward as evidence all the time. And I'm going to say, like, if you're going to go by that, then you would have to say, wow, you really have to give a lot of credence to Islam as well, and a lot of credence to Hinduism, and any religion that's been here for this long and converted a lot of people. And wait, if Christianity's in decline and less people are believing it, does that mean that we should believe it less? I mean, it's all ridiculous. And then I really felt like Adam Curry kind of like fell apart at that point and basically said, well, if I'm going to believe a conspiracy theory on this amount of writing, then I have to believe Christianity because there's been a lot more writing on it. I mean, the logic is just like completely flawed.
Yeah, it's a misunderstanding in a couple different ways. I mean, first of all, Christianity became like the dominant force in Western thought. So, of course, there's going to be a lot written on it. Right. The ideology that we live in is influenced by Christianity, for better or for worse. And the other thing that I think he misunderstands is the way that the ancient texts were preserved. They were preserved by Christians. Like, the reason, for example, that we have Jewish apocalyptic writings from like the late 2nd century of the before the Common Era is because there were Christian groups that affirmed those texts as scripture and so preserved them. And so some of those writings have been preserved. A lot of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible has been preserved because Christians have preserved it throughout time because they were copying the texts that they wanted to copy, and they were the ones that had the productive means to copy texts. So those texts, of course, are going to survive in larger numbers. They were the texts that were being produced. They were the texts that were being copied.
And not to mention that
anything about the religion being true, that there's a lot of texts about it.
Yeah, and not to mention that Rome adopted Christianity as its official religion, which is why it became mainstream, and then that's when like the writing really exploded. But again, what I think is fascinating here is like by his logic, he really should not be a conspiracy theorist because there's a lot more writing about 9/11 that has nothing to do with the conspiracy theory. Like if you're simply going by quantity, which seems to be what his argument is, like if you were also like as a conspiracy theorist, like he should be like a Gnostic or something. He should have some like weird heretical viewpoints where there's not as much written about it, or stuff that was like covered up by the establishment, like the very definition of a conspiracy. But he doesn't go down that road. He seems to be just accepting like Orthodox Christianity in a very non-conspiratorial way, ironically.
Yeah, who is the one that's covering all this up? if you can buy Josh McDowell's book in Barnes and Noble probably
Yeah,
tomorrow,
that's a good point.
Why is it? How is this a big secret? It's like literally like you could anyone in any church in evangelical Christianity has heard of this book.
Yeah, and where is there even a Barnes and Noble anymore?
True. Yeah. You can order it from the comfort of your own home. Okay, let's push onward.
We don't know.
No.
So how would you know that this guy who lived 2,000 plus years ago
That's why.
is actually the Son of
That's
God?
why I call myself a believer.
Because you just believe.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've seen what it has done for my own life.
And I think right there is really the key. And this is what, in most of my conversations with believers, where I'm challenging them, it usually ends at this exact place. You can talk about the evidence and they can recommend whatever books, but when it comes down to it, I just believe it, and that's where it ends. And I think that's where a lot of skeptics or non-believers are saying, well, I need evidence in order to believe it. And I think what Joe Rogan keeps coming back to is like, what's the evidence? What's the evidence? And it's not good enough for Joe Rogan just to say, well, I just believe it. For me, and I think for Ben and for many people out there, like the scientific method, like we need evidence to believe something, because there's people telling us a lot of things. There's people telling us all kinds of different religions are true. There's people saying that they were abducted by aliens. There's people, and my answer to all of that is like, okay, show me the evidence. I mean, I could just write it off completely and say what you're saying is stupid or it's ridiculous and I'm not going to believe it. But no, I'm saying, all right, show me the evidence, because I want to be persuaded the way you're persuaded. And the answer is like, well, I don't really have the evidence. I just believe it. I'm sorry, but that's not good enough.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that it's not convincing to an unbeliever as a reason to believe, to say like, oh, my life was transformed by this. So even though I don't have any good evidence, you should also believe it. People, and it doesn't privilege the Christian God or the Christian experience. I mean, every religious person in the world says the same thing. That they believe eventually, if you break down and interrogate them far enough, they'll say that they believe, oh, well, look at what it's done for my life. Look at the way it's transformed my relationships. Look at the positive things that it's done for my family. Look at for the way that it helps me cope with the pain of this world. And like those things are all fine, but they're not going to make me believe something that's nonsensical.
It could be that is very helpful for them, and I'm not going to criticize that at all, but it's certainly not persuasive to anybody else. And again, like I'm not someone on here just criticizing religion for the sake of criticizing it. If somebody personally, is given, emotional help from it, or if it's helping them in their life, like maybe deal with grief or deal with suffering or pain, I'm not going to criticize that. But I'm very interested in the question of what is the truth of these claims, and those type of answers are not persuasive for me, and I don't think they're persuasive for most people.
Yeah, and I think that I agree. I don't like to criticize people. Whatever allows you to cope with this cold world, I don't want to be overly harsh. But I do also think there's like an ideological problem with just looking at things that allow you to soften the trauma that is life. And I think transplant like some of the things in this world to like some sort of like a terrestrial other world. Or extraterrestrial otherworld. So it's like, we don't have to really worry about suffering here, because suffering is all going to be eased in another world. Well, that makes people not be sensitive to suffering here. And so I think that there's a way that it can be problematic as well. I guess we're saying there's a lot of ways it could be problematic, but
religion in general comes with a lot of baggage. If it offers you some comfort in your own life, I'm not going to criticize that, but I am going to criticize if you're proselytizing and not allowing science to be taught in the schools, or things that can be really harmful to this world. That's why I think a lot of people criticize religion or have a problem with it.
And this is a far cry from oh, I believe because the evidence is so convincing. Like, now we've gotten to the real truth. It's not that the evidence is convincing at all. There's no evidence that he stated that's convincing at all. What he says is convincing is ultimately, well, I've seen what it's done for my life and other people's lives.
Right.
So after this long, 10, 15 minutes into the interview, we finally gotten to the truth of Adam Curry.
Right. And of course, you could say that about any religion. You can point to people who have found comfort in any religion in the world and non-religion.
Like, you know, the people that are like into The Secret. I remember,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
you
Secret,
make your own destiny. I go,
yeah.
babies get
Mood
killed
board,
in
a mood board.
drive-bys. Babies get killed in drive-bys.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say that. You can't say everything that happened to you is because of your thoughts. That's ridiculous.
No.
I think it has some effect.
This idea about The Secret, and he says it's all bullshit because babies get shot in drive-bys. You could make the same argument about Christianity, because all this idea that, you know, have faith and God has a plan for your life. Well, did God have a plan for that baby that got shot in a drive-by? Or when something good happens to somebody and they say, it's an answer to prayer because I prayed for this and God came in but I guess like he's giving you special treatment and he didn't give special treatment to that other person that died. Like if one person survives a train wreck and that person comes out and said like, God is good, he is with me, he answered my prayer. It's like, okay, he answered yours, but not like the, 300 other people that died in the crash. So I think that like what Joe Rogan's criticism there in general about The Secret and like a lot of like new age type thinking, I think could be applied equally to Christianity.
Yeah, I think there's a whole wave of Christianity, the prosperity gospel that teaches almost essentially the same thing as The Secret. But the question is always, and this is the question with prayer too. I mean, so if it's answered, then to what degree is it answered? If positive thinking can affect the universe, to what degree does it affect the universe? And if it can't prevent babies from getting shot in drive-bys, then like who really cares? Who really cares? Like if you can't pray for anything, if prayer only works for some things and not big things, and it can't be for yourself, I mean, is that really what the Bible teaches when it talks about prayer, or does it talk about praying so you can move mountains with your faith? And I just think that this is a really, I think like on one hand, I don't affirm any of this, The Secret and all of that, like sort of new agey positive thinking stuff. I think it's I think it's worse than BS. I think it's like a phenomenon that could only happen in America, and is related to American nationalism and like sort of a positive theological idea of America's purpose in the world as like a shining beacon of light. But that being said, I mean, I think that it's just. I think that you're right. Like, there's not a measurable difference between the idea in Christianity of like praying and having some sort of an effect, and some sort of a positive thought having some sort of effect. I mean, I think it's like the same type of. I think they can be equally ridiculed.
Yeah, and I also would turn Joe Rogan's arguments around on him. I mean, earlier he was saying extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary evidence, which I totally wholeheartedly agree with. But then he starts here talking about how your positive vibes can have an effect. I mean, I don't know the words he used, but something. He's like not much of an effect, but it does make a difference. I'm like, okay, well, where's your evidence for that? I mean, like I think that's a pretty extraordinary claim. And he himself said it wasn't logical. So again, like I think he should use evidence. He's basically just kind of designing his own religion at that point, and I think everybody has to avoid that temptation.
Yeah, I think that's the real problem with what Rogan is doing, is that he's sort of just creating a religion that he could believe in if he wanted to, and then saying, well, that's probably, if there is a truth out there, that's probably what the truth is.
Yeah.
And that's not a proper way to even figure out. It's not a proper way to figure out if there is a true God, if there is a God, if there's a true religion. But it's not even a good way to figure out if something is true, to start with what you want to be true and then try to find evidence for it.
Yeah, and I think that's what he's doing. But ultimately, it's interesting to me because what he's describing, which, like we said, is his religion that he's inventing, is not at all compatible with Adam Curry's Christianity. And I think Joe Rogan is trying to find a middle ground to be like, yeah, why don't we just kind of agree on this stuff? And I'm like, no, if you study like historical Christianity, like it's not what you're saying is not at all compatible with it. Like you have to believe in all the what you consider to be like ridiculous things. Like a talking snake, or even the resurrection, as Joe Rogan probably thinks that's ridiculous. And I just think it's interesting because I feel like he's trying to find this middle ground, but if he really studied Christianity, he would realize like there is no middle ground there.
Yeah, I think a lot of these guys, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, want to, in a way, like affirm the regressive parts of Christian morality without having to affirm the sort of ridiculousness of the fairy tales.
Yeah, and I find this even in, like conservative Reformed Christianity where, they try to reinterpret the literal days of creation into millions of years to kind of make room for a little bit more scientifically plausible understanding of Genesis. And there's a lot of Christians that are really like concerned about, the way they don't want to be thought of as crazy kooks. And, like that's why in a way I actually have some respect for the flat earth Christians out there, because they're saying like, no, like the Bible actually says the earth is flat and I'm going to believe it. It's like, hey, if you really take it seriously and you really believe it, like, yeah, don't use modern science. Like just only sola scriptura, only goes on what the Bible says. Well, it has 4 pillars, 4 corners. Earth is flat, and you know what? There's a firmament, a hard, hammered out firmament dome over the earth, and I believe that. In a way, I have respect for those guys, even though what they believe is the most batshit crazy of anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fundamentalists are a huge problem and are dangerous to society. But the one thing that I do respect about them is that they actually carry to the fullest extent what they say they believe. They like hold to what at least they think is a literal understanding of the text, and are unwilling to compromise on anything. In that way, at least they're consistent. I think there's a lot of inconsistency that goes unrecognized. There's a lot of cultural preference that goes on throughout interpretation everywhere else. That I think is selective, if that makes sense.
Well, so there it is, folks. After 20 episodes of the Skeptics Bible Project, we said something good about fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah, absolutely. You knew it was going to happen eventually.
There's a guideline which gives you just an incredibly good feeling. It has made my life that much happier, and the people who I meet are just happy people. We don't sit around talking about God, but
That's the goal, though, right?
I don't think so.
I mean, in life, no, to be happy.
Oh yeah.
I think it's interesting because a lot of the Christians that I know, and I think that a lot of people in America see these days, they don't come across as happy people. I mean, images of January 6th come to mind, and Trump rally, where most of these people would consider themselves Jesus-loving Christians, and there's just so much hate and fury in their eyes, not to mention the policies that are explicitly hateful against LGBTQ people and women's rights in general. And so, no, like, if he's going to persuade me to be a Christian because of all the happy Christians out there, maybe if this was the 1970s, I could be a little bit closer to that in like a Jimmy Carter type of way. or with a Billy Graham Christianity. I did see that a little bit. Not that I was around in the 70s, but from what I know about it, that was a little bit more of the case than it is now. Because modern evangelical Christianity, I think, like, has really been branded as like a hate group, which is the entire reason. If you listen to our previous episode about the He Gets Us campaign, the whole reason they're trying to rebrand Christianity is because so many people view Christians in America as basically a like anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ hate group.
Yeah, I agree completely. I also just think that along the same lines, I mean, for one, I think that happiness is a weird construct to make like the end all and be all of what your religious experience is, because happiness is like just a complicated construct. But yeah, I just don't think that I also don't know what people Adam Curry is hanging out with, that he says, oh, these Christians, they just keep to themselves and don't
Right.
get involved with anything. I mean, like, they're literally like trying to make policy to dehumanize people. So they're completely involved in the most regressive type of politics that are going on right now. Like, Christians aren't these like happy people that are conclaved in their little communities, not bothering anyone, filled with love. They're in some cases people protesting outside of troops' funerals, talking about how God hates homosexuals. So I mean, that's obviously an unfair characterization of all Christians. But I mean, like, to pretend that they're all sitting around innocently happy is just not a fair representation of evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, and to be fair, like you said, I mean, I do know a lot of very nice Christians who are very happy, and I have a great time having conversations with them. So I'm not stereotyping all Christians and saying that all of them are like that. I am talking more about the image that we all see of Christianity, like in mainstream media. And there's a reason that Christianity is becoming less popular in America and around the world. And it's because it's associated with hate, and it's associated with that type of aggression. And I think you made a really good point earlier, Ben, when you were talking about like, that's like Adam Curry seems to be defining like the point of Christianity about his own personal happiness. That's not really what historical Christianity has taught or what the Bible teaches. It's really more about like, yeah, you're going to suffer in this life. Like, you need to like give up your wealth. You need to give everything you have to the poor. You need to be willing to give away your family and leave your family. And you need to be willing to not be married. And don't worry, because the suffering won't be long, because Jesus will be back any day now. And Mother Teresa comes to mind, who basically, instead of offering actual relief, and this is Christopher Hitchens' criticism, to sick people, she basically said, yeah, like, continue your suffering, but God is with you in your suffering, and that should bring you comfort ultimately. So I just think that his picture of what Christianity is isn't really backed up by the history of the church or what we find in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to raise that same point. But I 100% agree.
All right, let's move on.
Like you're saying, like, I'm happy. We're around happy people.
Yeah.
That's the goal, right? That's what everybody wants. So, like, whatever methods you get to get there, it's interesting that some people would rather not get there and rather be in a shitty, depressed state as long as they're not duped.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, I was going to say. That's basically what Joe Rogan is saying. Like, a lot of people would rather know the truth and be miserable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why I think happiness is really a false category. And because you can be perfectly happy living in the Matrix, but not really know what's going on around you and not have any clue to like the reality that's around you. It is very much not the goal of Christianity. Christianity is taking up your cross and following Christ. And I don't even think that it's a category that really like is very prevalent in the Bible.
Yeah.
So it's weird to make that like the end all and be all of everything. Like it's not. I mean, I think I said in another episode, Christianity is immensely impractical. And so to pretend that its goal is happiness, no, I mean, its goal is to do right. Its goal is to follow the teachings of Jesus. Its goal is to prepare for the coming of the Son of Man. Those are the earliest goals of Christianity. The goal is to build the collective of believers, and if that takes cutting all ties with your family, then that's what you need to do. So I just think that happiness is not really something that's a big factor that I see in Christianity.
No, and I think it goes along with the prosperity gospel that does kind of teach that like the point is for you to be happy and for you to prosper, and God will give you that kind of prospering through faith and really through giving to the church, and so in that way it does fit in with a certain brand of Christianity, but like both Ben and I don't think that that goes along with what the Bible actually teaches.
Yeah, much more close to Victoria Olstein theology than and the secret. Again, it's like if the goal is just happiness, it's just finding your magical formula.
Yeah, so thanks, Ben, for bringing that video to my attention. I hadn't seen it, and it is interesting to see. Like, I think what's fascinating for me about the whole thing is, what regular people that are not necessarily like deep into like the evangelical world that we grew up in, and how they are, experiencing Christianity and these notions. Like you're hearing Joe Rogan hear about these things, like it sounds like for the first time, and even this guy who's a new believer, and he has such like a simplistic understanding of Christianity to the point he's really not even able to defend it. That's what I found fascinating about it. I think if you were to go back to, let's say, the 1960s or before, I think the average person would just have a much higher understanding of like the Christology and the theology, and hearing them talk, I think it gives like a very interesting snapshot into like the current state of like Christian belief in America.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that the most fascinating stuff. I mean, it's hard to be. I don't want to overly criticize Adam Curry because there's no reason that as a new person in a religion that he would have all the answers. But why would you go on a podcast, the largest podcast in America or one of the largest podcasts in America, to talk about this stuff if you don't really know what you're talking about? And that's the problem that I find in the whole sort of like media sphere around biblical studies and Christianity is a lot of pseudo-scholarly stuff, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of evangelical propaganda. And most people don't have the basic understanding of the Bible to be able to discern the difference between even those type of things, even between pseudo-scholarship and evangelical apologetics, let alone comparing that to like the real critical history of the Bible or the real history of early Christianity, which is far more interesting. I think that the interest that people have in these sort of like conspiratorial versions shows that there actually is an interest out there to know the actual story, which I think is more interesting.
And I think that, what we're seeing with this kind of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding about Christianity today, I think it leads us into what we might be talking about in our next episode if we end up doing this on this revival that's happening, because I think Christianity is in need of a revival, if only for the reasons that Christians are just so unfamiliar with what Christian doctrine even is. But we'll get into that hopefully next time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one.
Good night, everybody. The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.